So, one take that I've heard a little bit more recently, I don't quite remember where, it's been a while, I'm admittedly very late on this, and it also might have been brought up by multiple people before at this point, but the idea of a global paint nerf, that paint ever since Splatoon 2 has been increasing and increasing overall, and we've hit a point to where we should start reining that number back in a little bit. You know, it's not a crazy take, it might be a bit more popular now because we put this thing in the game, you know, and this paints a lot, you know? So I get it. But today I want to talk a little bit about that. Would a global paint decrease be a good idea? What would be some of the repercussions or things we'd have to balance around, and should we actually do it? So, let's start by that. First of all, let's get a percentage out there. About how much would you have to decrease the paint for it to be a relevant, noticeable change? Now, in terms of it being considered an actual rework to the game, or a change of its mechanics, think, you know, 11.0 worthy, I think it would have to be around 5 to 10% total. And the reason I have a fluctuating percent is because, of course, every weapon is affected by a percent differently. So, for example, the Dreadringer, which paints like 27 points per flick, would be affected a lot by even a 5% change. Whereas a weapon that barely paints at all, such as the Clash Blaster, might not even notice it. So, if you wanted to keep the changes more even to how the paint is scaled normally, you would have to have the higher painting weapons affected by less, around 5%, and the less painting weapons affected more, by about 10%, so that they would, you know, kind of even out to the same ratios they are today. I am obviously very roughly estimating all the numbers right now. It could be a little bit different. But that's, you know, for the amount we're aiming for, it'd be around there. You would have to do that scaling. There's two other things that this could mess with. The main one is the paint trails. So, remember how we just talked about Clash Blaster? Yeah, Clash Blaster right now can barely paint in a straight line after getting some buffs to it. Like, even this is not, like, the most terribly consistent thing. If you take, like, 5 to 10% away from this, it might be a little bit of a problem. So you would have to adjust the radius elsewhere, like maybe you'd have to take the paint away mostly from this part of the shot, etc. And that's the thing you'd have to look at for every single main weapon in the entire game, because all of them could potentially be affected. Even something like Dynamo, for how well it paints. You'd have to make sure the paint that goes near the weapon isn't changed too much, because that's a big part of this weapon, that, you know, you can get into that paint not too difficultly. That was a buff all the way back in Splatoon 2, so you'd have to keep that into account. And, you know, you could keep going, etc., etc., etc. Weapons that paint lines, that kind of deal, you'd have to make sure all of it worked out properly. The other problem would be special charge. Now, I know for a lot of people, generally having less special output might seem like a good thing, but you can tweak these numbers in a bad way. Specials are still important for the overall flow of the game, and you don't want them to get too much worse. With a 5 to 10% paint decrease, it would become noticeably worse. 5% of 100 is 5. You know, I don't think I need to explain that one. So 5% of 200 is like, you know, that's the default points for special change, is about 10 points for special. And that's the low end. That's a 5% change. It could be even higher. So, I think you would have to offset this. I think you would also have to globally decrease the points for special for every single weapon in the game by at least 10. And this is also why I think you'd have to change it by at least 5%, because a 5% change in the points for special change, at least for 200 points for special weapons, would naturally cancel each other out, you know, and that's kind of the default in this game. So you'd have to look into something like that. You'd have to adjust all the points for special numbers, and that'd be a little bit hard and difficult to do as well. And we're still not done, because there's other potential problems besides the most direct stuff. So, I'm once again going to plug my Splatoon balancing video that I did, the paradox of Splatoon 3's balancing, the little time loop that we have here. And I talked about that a lot when discussing nerfing, you know, the main midline fighting weapons. And as we've nerfed those weapons down, they've become more and more essential in terms of, you know, what weapons we see. It's become more important to spec into them. Paint might have the exact same problem. If everything paints a lot less, you might actually need more weapons that paint in your team comp in order to compensate for, you know, the lack of paint that you used to have. So running things like Milky Way's comp with Pen, Pro, and Dooley might be made a lot more mandatory than they kind of are right now. you would have to run more painting weapons overall, which could have a negative effect on the game. And yes, I'm aware that the midline meta has shifted away now, but that's not just because of nerfs to those weapons, it's because we just had an entire game balance change that specifically buffed shorter range weapons more, and then we buffed Blaster. So yes, I still think that video still holds tact, because what ended up changing it was in fact buffs, and not nerfs. Like always, really, unless the nerfs are too much. So, there's a lot of problems in this. But I do want to state, I do think that painting power creep is a genuine issue. I do think there are a lot of main weapons that paint way too well, and it's very hard to adjust those without toning back the paint of largely everything, because a lot of weapons that paint very well belong to one class, belong to shooters. So having weapons like Dynamo or Dread or Heavy or Bow or Reflux or whatever that paint a lot, they kinda have to, or they're not gonna keep up with these weapons. And so if we want to tone the paint back on a lot of these cases, we kind of have to change it globally. We kind of have to tone it down in general. And paint power has increased dramatically compared to Splatoon 1. In a lot of cases, that can be a good thing, but I do agree the number's gotten too high. So, is it just worth all the negative repercussions? Well, not exactly. Here's what I would do personally. To me, I think that a large enough paint decrease all in one patch is just simply not feasible. It has too many potential drastic repercussions to do it as an overall nerf like that. It is simply too much. So I think instead, the goal should be to kind of stop the problem from escalating any further and address it more gradually. This might be one of the few times I'm actually going to advocate for a slower approach to fixing the problem. What I would do is instead of 5 to 10%, I would make it much, much smaller. About 2 to 3% total. This is so low that the overall points for special, changes to get to your special would only be about 4 or 6 points. Low enough to where you wouldn't have to change the points for special requirements. You would slightly lower special output, but it would only be a little bit. It's also so low to the fact that it wouldn't really have a high chance of messing with things like paint trails and how weapons are balanced. It'd be easier to tone around it. While it wouldn't be super noticeable, it would still drop things down a decent bit. Every weapon painting just slightly worse is going to add up when it's a team comp. If it's 3% on every weapon, that's an overall change of, 12% total, I believe. That might not be exactly how it works. But you get the idea, right? It affects everyone on your team comp, not just you. In a 4v4 setting, that will add up. Not enough to drastically change anything, but that's kind of the point. The only change would be there's just a little bit less paint on the floor, but hopefully nothing else. And then you can start to kind of go from there and adjust things further. A lot of these changes, I feel, have to be to specific main weapons at some point, and looking at how they're balanced. But I think overall toning it back a little bit is a good enough change to kickstart things and at least, kind of create the maximum this problem will ever reach being right now. It's kind of saying that it won't get any worse than it is today. That said, I have one more thing to talk about. I do think there should be a 5 to 10% paint decrease, but not for mains, not for subs, but for specials. Almost every special right now paints too much. There's some exceptions here, right? Like Bubble probably doesn't need to be adjusted. Kraken doesn't really paint. Some specials like Whale don't paint. And there are the occasional exceptions like Inkjet, which do need to paint over people a bit when they hit them. But almost every special in the game could paint like 5 to 10% less and it'd probably be better. Especially specials that can cap zones like Tri-Strike, Reef Slider, and even Ink Vacuum. But think about Crab AoE be a little bit less oppressive. Think about Zuka AoE actually having to hit you to paint over you. Stuff like that, These would probably be fine. Tentamissiles not painting as much would be another one. There's a lot of changes here that I think would be healthy. So in terms of specials, that's where I think 5 to 10% would be a little bit more okay. Anyway, that is what I would like to see in terms of the whole paint global decrease. Let me know what you guys think in the comments, and I'll see you all next time.